Hello, everyone, and welcome to the national launch event for the Influencing Gen Vape report. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which we gather today. I am on Wurundjeri land here in Melbourne, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. My name is Khalid Muse. I'm an Associate Research Fellow at Deakin University and a VicHealth Community Champion, and I'll be your host for this webinar. Today, we'll hear about VicHealth's collective impact approach to vaping, the Australian-first research project Influencing Gen Vape, led by our research partner, the Behaviour Change Collaborative. And we'll finish off with a Q&A where you have the opportunity to ask questions about the research the BCC will talk through. I'd like to now invite VicHealth CEO, Dr. Sandro Demetrio, as he welcomes you all to today's webinar. Thanks, Sandro.
Thanks very much, Khalid, and I too like to join you in acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on here in West Melbourne, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge any First Nations leaders that are joining us today across Victoria or indeed across Australia and beyond. I think it's important, though, that these words don't simply become words that we repeat, but that we continue to reflect on our role as allies and partners in ensuring that we do make important progress on the stubborn and persisting health inequities that face so many First Nations communities and leaders across the country. And I certainly commit as CEO of VicHealth to continuing to be a strong partner and ally in working alongside and behind community leaders, First Nations leaders across our country. I also recommit my agency and myself to the important pathway that we're on here in Victoria and nationally to reconciliation, to fairness, and ultimately a pathway to treaty. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be able to open this session, this important session today. There is no more urgent issue facing the health of young people in many ways, certainly when you speak to community leaders across Victoria, and certainly when you speak to health and school leaders across Victoria than the rapid, unprecedented and extremely concerning rise of e-cigarettes. It's no accident that in just a few years, vaping has gone from the margins to a significant challenge for us all and for societies, not just across Australia, but around the world. The tobacco industry and big tobacco, as many of us know them, have reared their ugly heads once again. And just like over half a century ago, are using many of the same tactics, processes, and of course approaches to influence policymakers, to get in front and weaponise the data of young people, and to ultimately push products that they know and we know are associated with disease, that come with significant risk, that are highly addictive and ultimately are toxic, into the hands, into the lungs and into the lives of young Australians. Where we stand today at the beginning of 2024, we really do stand staring down the barrel of, once again, a new generation of Australians being addicted to nicotine and the lifelong concerns and risks that will pose. While the recent vaping legislation in Australia and the world-first legislation that Minister Mark Butler and his team have brought to Australia puts Australia firmly back at the forefront in tobacco control, there is so much work to be done. We know that this challenge is complex and constantly evolving, and that there are so many organisations working alongside VicHealth and others in this space to do everything that we can to protect new generations from the harms of vaping, from the addictive harms of nicotine, and of course the potential long-term health consequences. And I do want to pause for a moment to really acknowledge the range of leaders in this room, this digital room, but also across Australia. I don't want to for a second pretend that somehow VicHealth is leading the charge, that we are doing it alone, or that we are even the leaders in this space. We are a small cog in the very big and important machinery that is public health. And just as we as a sector and a community have faced very significant challenges in the past, the best example, of course, was with tobacco itself. We will come together and we will unite against what is a significant and growing threat to young people in our communities. But how we build the self-efficacy of a team who is facing this new dynamic, this new ecosystem that is facing the weaponisation of their data by industry to sell products that we all know are associated with long-term disease outcomes. How we work and walk alongside young people across Australia today in a non-judgmental way to give them the skills to be able to navigate as we do everything to change the structural drivers and determinants to make that journey more easy is going to be critical. Influencing Gen Vape is an Australian-first research project that aims to deeply understand teenagers' experiences with vaping and determine how best to support and discourage them from vaping, meeting teens where they're at. VicHealth has invested in this research through our research partner, the Behaviour Change Collaborative, so that all organisations tackling teen vaping in Australia and even beyond can access the insights for free. To enable change at scale, we need to align our efforts, share knowledge, and harness our collective strengths. At a state level, VicHealth is leading a collective impact approach, working very closely with our long-time and valued partners and experts in the space, Quit Victoria. This collective impact approach brings together local governments, health professionals, sporting bodies, policymakers, cultural organisations, universities, and others to develop strategies and interventions to reduce and prevent young people from vaping here in Victoria. This, of course, adds to more than 18 months of work that has seen us support Quit Victoria to launch Australia's largest and Victoria's first mass media anti-vaping campaign, roll out school resources in all schools across Victoria, deliver supports for parents, including just last week, brand new resources supporting parents to be able to have meaningful conversations with their children and understand the issues. Even a first collaboration with the Melbourne Museum, leveraging the site that sees millions, over 1 million young people attend every year, and really utilising that partnership as an educational platform through an interactive exhibit that explains what's truly in a vape. And finally, in a few months, we will launch a brand new, unprecedented for Victoria, peer-to-peer campaign, leveraging many of our partners across the state. This is not an easy journey, and for all of us, or for many of us, it feels all too familiar, a little like Groundhog Day. But I think we are heartened by this incredible work and the important work of organisations like Behaviour Change Collaborative, by the partners that we're privileged to be able to work with across the state and across Australia. And indeed, I think the progress that we have been able to make over the last 12 months, the challenges are enormous, the stakes are high, but we are making progress and we'll continue to work alongside and with all of you as we ensure that we don't end up with another generation of Australians addicted to nicotine. On that, I'm going to hand back to Khalid and thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks, Sandro. We will now hear from the research team from the Behaviour Change Collaborative. To take us through the next hour, it is my pleasure to welcome Luke van der Beeke, Founding Managing Director, and Donna van Bueren, the Director of Behavioural Insights.
All right, thanks very much, Khalid. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where Donna and I are sitting today, which is the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I'd want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend my respect to any other First Nations people on the call today. I'd like to acknowledge the support of VicHealth, who obviously we have really enjoyed working with on this piece of research. It's been a really enjoyable and productive experience partnering with them. And I also just want to acknowledge the work of many other people who are working in this space, some well known, others perhaps not so well known. But yeah, our work is very much intended to augment and sort of add to the evidence base that is already out there. So the research that we undertook was designed to provide stakeholders across health, social and environmental settings with actionable insights that they can use to guide practice and support effective evidence-based intervention design and implementation. So this is really very much a practical piece of work. And, you know, much like VicHealth, the idea is that it's research to inform practice, and we're really keen to increase and build capacity within the sector. And that's the case for most of the work that the BCC undertakes. So before I hand over to Donna, who is the lead researcher and who'll run you through the findings, I just thought it would be useful to provide a bit of an overview about the Behaviour Change Collaborative. Many of you probably are not familiar with us, particularly if you're on the Eastern Seaboard. We're a social enterprise established in 2012, so we've been running for just over a decade now, and we work across a range of health, social and environmental challenges. So as much as we do a lot of behavioural research like this, we're not a research agency. The research that we undertake, as we've said previously, is used to inform interventions and approaches to affecting change. So we do a lot of social marketing, capacity building and training, advisory, so on and so forth, and quite a bit of co-design, participatory design also. We're a WASEC, so that's WA Social Enterprise Council endorsed social enterprise. And so what that really speaks to is the fact that we are very much a profit for purpose organisation, but we do not distribute profits to owners such as myself. So we very much reinvest, and we do an awful lot of in-kind and pro bono work as well. We work on projects that move the dial, and typically we work with non-government organisations and government, both here in Australia, and increasingly we're doing quite a lot of international work as well. The founders, myself and two others, are all from charity and NGO background, so it's very much in our DNA in terms of a very sort of core service offering in terms of what we deliver. We're a small team, but we have a very large network of associates and subject matter experts, academic partners, again, both here in Australia and overseas, that we lean on to deliver our work. Just very quickly, we also last year established a charity called the BCC Impact. And so any monies that we do generate that aren't needed to pay the bills here at Enterprise are pushed through into BCC Impact, which is very much geared towards reducing health inequality. So we're looking at determinants, structural, cultural, and commercial, amongst others, and really looking at those drivers of inequalities and how we can seek to address those through a behaviour change lens. So that got DGR status in November last year, and we're really excited about where that may take us moving forward. So finally, in terms of what we prioritise and our core values, for us, really everything we do is about meaningfully engaging with the communities, individuals that we seek to serve in a genuine, meaningful way. We put integrity first, and we very much apply an empathy lens to everything that we do, and really are focused on impact. So as I said earlier, everything that we do is geared towards a practical application and impact at community and individual level. So that is it from me. So I will now hand over to Donna, who's going to take you through the research. I would invite you to add questions into the chat, and I will sort of take out some of the low-hanging fruit as we move through, and then there'll be a session at the end where we'll be taking questions through Khalid. So I'll hand over to Donna. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. And hello, everyone. It's good to be here. And very exciting to be able to share the findings of this latest piece of research that the BCC has done in partnership with VicHealth. Before I begin, I thought I would just share with you the story of how did we get here. Because really the segmentation findings that we have to share with you today are the culmination of 2 years of research work that the BCC has been undertaking. And that work began in 2022 when, as a small team of researchers and social marketers, we are also a team of parents of teenagers. And we ourselves were observing our own children moving through high school, approaching high school and trying to navigate the nicotine-filled frontier that they indeed were finding themselves in. And we wanted to understand why was this happening, not just describe what was happening. And so we embarked upon a piece of really deep qualitative research that was funded by Healthway in Western Australia. It was research with over 90 teenagers from high school years 7 to 12. And that gave us a really deep look inside and an understanding of all of the influences on teen vaping. And it allowed us to develop a hypothesis in terms of how are those teenagers falling into groups, what do they have in common, and what might predict the likelihood to vape in the future. And from that, we've been fortunate to partner with VicHealth to be able to quantify those findings and to develop a robust segmentation, which is what I'm going to walk you through today. So to begin, I'll just share a little bit about the survey sample, because if there's any researchers around the room, they always want to know a little bit of a description of the sample. So I'll just begin by saying it was a survey of nearly 3,700 teenagers in high school years 7 to 12 from all over Australia. We had really good inclusion and representativeness by gender, by age group, so a distribution across years 7 through to 12, also by country versus metro locations, and as well as some of the other demographic findings you can see here. And what we found, first of all, in terms of vaping behaviour, is that sorry, we're just waiting for the slide to come up. Our sample validates the all of the other robust national surveys that have been done on vaping behaviour, that in our sample, in terms of ever vaping, we had almost a third, 27% of the sample have ever vaped. And then we look at those ever vapers, we find that we have a sample of 1 in 5 or 18% are what we term as currently vaping. And by current vaping, we describe that as they've vaped at least in the last few months. When we look at in terms of how often, or the frequency of how often they're vaping amongst that 18%, what we find is that, in fact, almost a third are vaping every day or every other day. So that's the distribution of our sample with respect to vaping behaviour. And that's what has led to the development of the segmentation of both vapers and non-vapers. So I'll now spend a bit of time introducing the 7 segments as an overview. And then what I'm going to do is spend the rest of the time walking you through a deep dive into each of those segments to understand them in more detail. So to develop the best fit segmentation, what we have done is base the segmentation on the likely predictors of vaping in the future or trying a vape in the future. So the first thing to note is that the underpinning dimensions of the segments are a complex mix of knowledge, of attitude and motivation, but also of opportunity and of personality, as well as actual vaping behaviour, current vaping behaviour. And the segmentation has produced these 7 distinct segments. The first thing to note is that the advantage here is what we see is we're able to look inside the count, if you like, or the prevalence of teenagers who vape and teenagers who don't vape. So when we actually look at the segments distributed by vaping behaviour, we can see that the first 3 segments account for the 4 in 5 teenagers who have never vaped. And then the remaining 4 segments account for the 1 in 5 teenagers who are currently vaping. And then we have 10% of trialists. If we look at what is the distribution by proportion of the segments, we see that, not surprisingly, given 4 in 5 teenagers don't vape, that most of the larger segments fall to the left-hand side. And of note here, and I will spend a little bit more time delving into this susceptible segment, is this segment 1/4 of all teenagers are what we deem to be susceptible or at risk of vaping for a number of factors. So I'm going to spend the rest of the presentation walking you through each of the segments. I will dwell a little bit more on the segments that are where the opportunity is for primary prevention. So particularly on the segments that are not vaping, where we can apply interventions to prevent take-up or to maintain their non-vaping status. And I will share also insights into the vaping segments and provide insights in terms of what we think they need in terms of intervention, levers and support. So to start with the rejectors, this is the segment that we sort of describe as never have and probably never will. They're the group of teenagers who make good choices generally by way of both nurture and nature. So they tend to move away from taking risks, and they're deeply committed to not vaping at this point in time. They're really well informed about the harms of vaping and the risks, and they actively reject any of the claimed benefits of vaping. So this is kind of your advocates of non-vaping of the future. They're ones that are happy to stand up and be counted as not vaping and not supporting vaping, to the extent that they'll even avoid friend groups or social settings where there is vaping, and they will go out of their way to maintain their status as a rejecter of vaping. If we dive into them in a little bit more detail, the first thing to note is whilst these segments are not defined by age or by gender, we do see patterns emerging across the segments by age and gender. So the rejector segment are somewhat the youngest of the segments, and they are skewed towards our year 7, 8s, as well as our year 9s and 10s, but definitely over-indexing at the younger age groups. They're also slightly skewing male, and although again not dominated by males. This is the segment that are the least likely for risk-taking and rebellion. They also are the least likely of all the segments to care about others, what others think of them. So we know that social norms, social expectations and peer opinion has a lot to do with shaping vaping behaviour. So it's not surprising we see this first segment, the rejectors, as being the group of teenagers who are least likely to care about the opinions of their friends and their social groups. Most of their friends don't vape, so they index low on opportunity to vape. And that's partly because of their self-protective actions in terms of putting themselves in social situations where vaping isn't omnipresent. They're most likely of all the segments to form friendships in sports teams and sports settings or in hobby groups and clubs. Somewhat that's probably a reflection of their younger age, but they also are not relying on social media to form friendships, but are more engaged in club, community and sports type events and opportunities for friendship making. So what makes them rejectors? First of all, their parents and their family. They're highly influenced by their parents and the views of parents. And one of the reasons we got from the qualitative research is that they are not vaping because they know that there are consequences for vaping either in their families or in their social settings. And the need and the desire to not want to disappoint people that matter to them is highly protective for this group. They're highly knowledgeable about health harms, nicotine and chemicals, and they view vaping as addictive, as expensive, and in their view, it's hard to stop once you start. And as I said, they're highly trusting and informed by the influence, not just of their parents, educators and health professionals, but also identify with the opinions of their sports coaches and other close friends. So how do we influence rejectors. Really, our goals in terms of health promotion and social marketing for this segment is one of reinforcement through affirmation and reward, in the form really of attitudinal reward. So we want these teenagers to know and to believe that they are making really good decisions. We want them to feel proud of their decision not to vape and to hold on to all of their beliefs about the harms of vaping, and to move into that advocacy space where they feel confident about affirming all the reasons not to vape. And also we want to remind them that by not vaping, they're avoiding nicotine addiction and the health harms, long and short-term health harms that go with that. There's not much that we can do wrong with this segment, but we certainly don't need to be playing in the circle of myth busting with this segment of rejectors. And we don't want to trigger their curiosity because they have informed themselves and have decided not to vape. What we do want is for them to be able to retrieve and continue to retrieve correct fact-based information about vaping and its harms whenever they see the need to do that. So for this segment, they need good information. And my concern for this segment is that because they are over-indexing young, that as they move through high school, they may well encounter greater opportunity to vape and access to vapes, which we know is one of the contributing predictors of the likelihood to vape. So we want them to be developing young, really strong self-efficacy skills when it comes to being able to hold on to their strong opinion and view that vaping is harmful and be able to say no and reject vaping as they move through their high school years. And we want them to have really well-informed parents who are confident to talk about vaping with their teenagers. So there's plenty of opportunities for intervention design in the school curriculum and in school settings, but also lots of opportunity for those who work in community-based settings to be reinforcing correct messaging around vaping and the harms, and to be integrating anti-vaping messaging through, for example, sports clubs' codes of conduct. And one of the things we really learnt from teenagers here is we don't need to turn sports coaches or community leaders into educators about vaping, but we do want them to have a clear opinion and to make that opinion known, because for this segment and also the next segment, uninterested, just having an opinion and just reinforcing that vaping is harmful and it's not consistent with good sports performance or good teamwork is a really powerful and influential message for teenagers in this segment. So now let me introduce you to the segment we've called the uninterested. For this segment, it's not really even on their radar. So whilst they're also vaping, not vaping, and have made a conscious, deliberate decision not to vape, this group is far less knowledgeable about the harms of short or long-term harms of vaping or the contents and chemicals in vapes. Far less knowledgeable than the rejector segment, partly because it's not on their radar as much. They do believe that vaping is addictive. They do know that it's bad for your health, but that's a very superficial attitude or belief for them. They really can't actually provide a lot more reasoning behind why is it bad for you or how might it be harmful for you. They're the segment most likely to say, I know it's bad for me and I'm not interested. In fact, this segment was the least curious of all the segments about vaping. 100% of this segment were not curious about vaping. Like the rejectors, they skew younger, so they skew towards the year 7, 8s, but we do see more year 9s and 10s appearing in this segment, and they also are skewing slightly male as well. Like the rejectors, they have a really low appetite for risk-taking and rebellion, and they're also less likely also to care about the opinions of others and less likely to want to fit in with others. Again, most of their friends don't vape, so they have lower opportunity and exposure to vaping, but they do know some people who vape. And they're also socialising, developing peer groups and friendships that involve community-based settings, sports clubs and hobby clubs, rather than social media, which is consistent with their younger age as well. So this is the segment that are very similar to the rejectors in many ways, except in terms of their curiosity. So as I said earlier, this segment is the least curious, in fact, not at all curious about vaping. They claim to be knowledgeable, but as I said, their knowledge is very superficial. And I think for those of us who work in education or want to have an educative role, and for parent conversations, we're going to need to walk that fine line between giving correct information and making sure that this segment is well informed, but not spiking their curiosity. Because I said at the moment, this segment, it's really not on their radar. They do acknowledge, and they have heard, that there are some what we've called pleasure-seeking benefits of vaping. So they've heard that it tastes really nice. They've heard that there's a hit that you get from it, but it's not of interest to them. So they're self-exempting out of the behaviour that hasn't sparked their curiosity. And they have no intention to vape anytime soon, like the rejectors, even if they were offered it by a friend. And they trust the opinions of that wider circle of influencers, so parents, health professionals, teachers, the school nurse, as well as their sporting and club leaders. And they also, they don't want to let those people down. So how can we influence the uninterested? There, as I said, there is a role for us to play in terms of filling those knowledge gaps, because their anti-vaping knowledge is very superficial. They can't reel off the list of chemicals or the list of health harms that the rejector segment can list, but they also, that this is very much a product of them not having been curious so far. So really what we also want to do with this segment is reinforce their good decision not to vape, and have this affirmed by the people that matter to them: parents, educators, health professionals, club and sports influencers. We do want them to have access to facts and the correct information about vaping harms, vaping contents, and importantly about nicotine and the link between nicotine and addiction. But rather than to be pushing that information to them, what we want to do is get really clever about having that information easily and readily retrievable when an uninterested teenager may become interested. What we don't want to do is elevate their curiosity. We also just want to remind them, as well as the rejectors, that their non-vaping behaviour is in the majority, that most people are like them. And that's one thing we heard, and I'll move into this when I talk about the next segment, the susceptible segment, but that there is generally across the whole sample, there is an overestimated view of how popular vaping is. But we have to be careful about how we message to teenagers in a challenging way about this belief, because to many teenagers, in their view, vaping is really, really common and done by many teenagers, if not most teenagers. And this is because if you walk in their shoes and see it through their eyes, vaping is a clustered behaviour that mostly happens, and certainly begins to happen, in small social groups, friendship groups. So it looks like it's really common because what you see as a teenager is lots of teenagers vaping together. As they move into older age groups, they see it happening in parties and social group settings. And they don't think about the fact that in a party setting, those 30 kids then go back to they're distributed across a whole range of suburbs. And in fact, the vaping prevalence is not that high across all of those locations. But I think we have to really work with these teenagers with empathy and understanding that through their eyes, for many of them, vaping does seem really, really common, and reassuring the uninterested as well as the rejectors and the susceptible segment that they are in fact in the majority can be supportive for them. So what we want to avoid, though, is first of all triggering their curiosity, as I said, and also to be mindful that this is the group that don't yet have a strong set of strategy. They don't have a strategy or a skill set developed and ready at hand should they be offered a vape. So this is the group that don't know what they would do if they were offered a vape, and we need to arm them with that capability as, again, they move through high school. So what do they need? They certainly, as I said, need to be able to have easy access and be able to retrieve fact-based information whenever they become curious and as they move through their high school years. We would probably say that they are at the moment a lower intervention priority, other than to be mindful that they are far less anti-vaping advocates than our rejector group. So this is the group that, and particularly given that any segmentation is only a moment in time evaluation, this is the group that may not be stable in their uninterested status. And so certainly anything we can do through interventions and education to affirm their decision not to vape without making them highly curious is recommended. So now moving on to the segment that we have called the susceptible group, or the vulnerable. And the reason we've used that label is because we really feel that this group is highly vulnerable to the likelihood of vaping in the future. But they're almost hidden within the data that classifies teenagers as currently vaping or currently not vaping. And they're a relatively large group of teenagers. So they've never vaped before, they say, but they're highly curious about it. They're often in social situations and settings where vaping is more common. So in their view, vaping is a really popular and common thing to do. They're also wanting to fit in, and they do care much more than the other two non-vaping segments about what others think of them. Fitting in is important to many in this segment. And also critically is that they have far less confidence in themselves regarding what they would do if they were offered a vape and how they would navigate their way out of that situation. This is a group really crying out for self-efficacy skills in terms of being able to say no and to hold on to that position, particularly as they move through high school. Demographically, we see this segment getting slightly older. So we see greater distribution of year 9s and 10s and also years 11 and 12s in this segment. And we also see slightly balancing out in gender. So we, although the segment still skews slightly male, we see more females popping into this segment. As I said before, they care much more than the rejectors and the uninterested about what others think of them, and fitting in is more important. And they have far more opportunity to vape because they're socialising in circles where there is more vaping present, even though their close friends don't vape. So vaping is more normalised for this segment, and it won't be helpful to challenge them in a very rational way that actually vaping is a minority behaviour, because in their mind, it's a clustered and present behaviour. What is making them susceptible? Well, as I said before, they're the most curious of the non-vape segments, and they're the least knowledgeable about vaping when it comes to both contents and short and long-term harms. They do believe that you can get addicted to vaping, but they also have heard that it's pretty easy to avoid addiction. And the people that they see vaping are not vaping that frequently yet. So that's reinforcing their view that vaping is actually a behaviour that you can control. They've heard about and they believe the benefits, so they can reel off a range of reasons why you would vape. Taste, it's fun, the tricks, it helps you fit in, and it helps you cope with stress and having a bad day. This is the group that said themselves that they would be more likely to vape in certain social situations, and some of this group feel that they may be vaping in the future. So I kind of think about this segment is that group of teenagers that I think almost need a big hug, and we need to hold them back. They're almost, they're not really sure whether they'll be vaping in the future, and they don't know how to negotiate their way out of an opportunity to share a vape. They're more likely than than the other non-vape segments to trust the information about vaping on social media. So this is the last point I would make about this segment, is that they are now, slightly by virtue of their age skew as well, starting to pay more attention to social media, both from an advertising perspective and content perspective, but also starting to actually make friends and communicate using social media. So how can we influence susceptibles? We really feel that susceptibles are a huge priority for anyone working in prevention, and they really need our attention and they need our support. And I think that and they also need us to go younger with this age group. So because they're highly curious, really there's an opportunity to intervene and to work with this group, the susceptibles, at a younger age, where we can nip their curiosity in the bud and arm them with the same set of beliefs and attitudes that our uninteresteds and particularly our rejectors have adopted. So we do want to reinforce that they are still making a really great decision not to vape, and to reaffirm for them the benefits of not vaping. So everything, framing messaging in terms of the gains and what they gain from not vaping has got a lot of opportunity. We also think that the voice and the stories of the ex-vapers, the segment that I'll come to next, that we've called trialists, where there's opportunity for those voices and opinions to be heard, to nip the curiosity in the bud for susceptibles, may well have merit. Ex-vapers are really credible amongst non-vapers, and much more credible than hearing from teachers or adults about who've never vaped and who wouldn't know what it's like. We can challenge their perceived benefits around that vaping makes you feel good, makes you feel less stressed, helps you cope with stress, and around mood control. There's an opportunity to link those perceived benefits to poor mental health outcomes, and an opportunity to arm this group of susceptibles with other ways to build strong positive mental health other than vaping, to really address and challenge that one of the key benefits of vaping might be dealing with poor mental health. And we also really want to challenge the belief amongst this group that you can control your vaping, and most importantly, that you can avoid addiction if you vape at low and social levels, and to share the stories of addicted vapers about why they regret having ever started. So what do susceptibles need? They also need fact-based information, delivered also through health websites and social media, which is where they're starting to pay attention. And as I said before, this is the group that need better developed social skills, self-efficacy, in order to navigate through high school and all of the various opportunities they have to try vaping. Helping them to build skills on what to say and how to manage those conversations with their peers when they are offered vapes. As well, there's a huge opportunity to involve parents with this segment, well-informed parents who understand the risks and harms of vaping, and parents who share their opinion about the harms of vaping with their teenagers. So we suspect, based on the qualitative research that preceded the segmentation, that this is the group that are curious, that think they'll probably try in the future. And the reason they haven't overstepped into trial is because they are worried about the consequences at home or at school, getting caught, and they don't want to disappoint the people that matter to them. And that may well be what's keeping them from trying it so far. So there's a lot of opportunity for, as I said, starting intervention opportunities in the lower primary school age group for this segment, and also still opportunities for community-based intervention development through the sports and community club settings, as well as at home and through parents and particularly older siblings. We also have got the data, it's in the technical report, that breaks down each segment by the presence of older siblings. And we know that older siblings are highly influential, both when it comes to dissuading their younger siblings from vaping, but also in terms of enabling younger siblings to vape by providing the vapes to them. So now I've shared with you the profile and a bit of an insight into those first three segments. The teenagers who sit in the 4 in 5 of all teenagers who are currently not vaping. So I'll move now into talking about the other 4 segments who sit on the other side of that dotted line, if you like, who've tried vaping before, and share with you where they're at with vaping. The first segment that emerges is our trialists. So a small segment, 10% of our sample. If you like, we're loosely thinking of these as our ex-trialists or ex-vapers. But as I said, I stress this is a segment that it's only a moment in time indicator of where they're at. Our trialists are the teenagers who've tried it and they've stopped for now. So at the moment, they haven't vaped in the last few months. And partly that's because they didn't have a great experience with vaping, or they found that it actually didn't live up to expectation. So either their experiences were negative, they didn't like it, or in fact it was they were curious, but it didn't deliver them the wow benefits they expected, particularly around belonging or inclusion in social settings. And they say that they don't plan to go back to vaping in the future. So we would count these as former vapers or former trialists, but we don't really know what they're going to do in the future. Following the demographic and particularly the age and gender patterns that I've indicated on the non-vape segments, this is a segment that is now tracking older. So we see more year 9s and 10s and 11 and 12 sitting in this segment. And for the first time, we see the reversal in gender. So we see now this is the first segment that is over-indexing female. And in fact, interestingly, all of our segments who vape over-index female slightly. This is a group who they're far more social, which aligns with the fact that they're also indexing older. And they are outgoing and they have some appetite for risk-taking. But they're now starting to mix in settings beyond just formal club and social settings. So they're in parties now, going to more parties. They're definitely on social media. And they're now, for the older kids, they're starting to take up paid work, which is a huge setting where they're starting to make new friends. It also comes with having income and therefore more opportunity to buy vapes. And some of their friends do vape. So what is putting them in the trialist or ex-trialist segment? Well, it's the fact that they have tried, and also that they're really well informed about the risks of vaping, the harms and the contents of vape. So this is a segment who've dabbled and decided that it's not for them. Their view is that vaping is expensive, it's addictive, but they still concerningly do believe that it's possible to avoid harm and to avoid addiction by vaping very little. So this is a group that we want to strengthen that opinion that actually you need to not vape in order to avoid all of the harms that come from vaping and addiction. Not surprisingly, and this is important, and I'll come to this in the next segments. Critically, this is the segment that have never bought their own vape. So of the 10% of teenagers who've tried vaping in the past, none of them had bought a vape. Their past vaping was infrequent. It was a small number of times. It was in settings only with close friends, such as either at a party or at a friend's house. So vaping trial at school, we didn't see any evidence that that is starting in school settings in a particularly dominant way. And as I said, they say that they have no intention of vaping again. So in terms of intervention design, we want to reinforce, obviously, this segment to remain not vaping and strengthen and maintain their negative attitudes towards vaping, and also to somehow enable them to be visible in terms of their ex-vaping status. This is something that teenagers don't really want to do. They don't want to tell other teenagers what to do when it comes to vaping. They don't want to judge their peers, and they're very much of the view that if it's your choice to vape, and I see your choice to vape independent of whether you're my friend or not. So this is a real conundrum that we've got to grapple with, is how do we mobilise and create advocates for not vaping without putting them in situations where they're going to damage friendships. We do want them to really strongly believe and affirm that they have made a really strong and positive decision. They've tried it and they've made the best decision to not continue with vaping. And we want them to really have very salient beliefs about the benefits that they are receiving from not vaping. So we want them to be able to articulate and really believe that they are healthier, more fit, and are avoiding a whole lot of problems, the harms that we know, by choosing to not continue to vape. So this group really, we can sort of treat more like our rejectors, if you like, because they do profile attitudinally as being quite anti-vaping, having tried it. But we want to build their capacity and their capability and strengthen it so that if they are offered and presented with opportunities to vape in the future, that they don't return. And we also, potentially could enable them to be, as I said, vocal in terms of talking about dispelling the curiosity about vaping, particularly amongst the susceptibles who would find the views and opinions of trialists really credible. So now I'll move on to the 3 segments that are currently vaping at different levels, and we'll start with the experimenters. This, if you like, is our light recreational users, our current dabblers when it comes to vaping. They are vaping on average about once every few months, some more often, some weekly. And they're vaping in mostly private settings and with people that they know well and that they trust. So this is very much an experimenting behaviour for them. They're really divided, concerningly, they're divided in whether they think they're going to continue vaping, whether they're going to cut back in the future or whether they want to stop altogether. So they're not thinking about the future when it comes to their vaping behaviour. They're really just in the here and now. This is the group who would be most likely to say vaping's pretty harmless and I've got this under control. They're outgoing and they do have a higher appetite for risk-taking compared to the non-vaping segments, and their desire to fit in is much greater. And like the trialists, they're social, they're making friends now in settings like parties and paid work. But also they are connected into some hobby and sports. So they're also involved in dance, in art and other hobby clubs. And they also have access now to their own money because some of them do have part-time jobs. So for experimenters, concerningly, even though they are experimenting with vaping, they have knowledge gaps. We see this in the data, particularly around the contents of vapes and the chemicals. They certainly don't perceive vaping as addictive. They would reject the notion that vaping for them is addictive, and they really believe that they can avoid addiction, as I said, by not vaping too often. They see the value in the immediate and superficial benefits of vaping. So for this group, it's all good and harmless. It's fun. It tastes great. The nicotine hit is fun. And they do acknowledge that it really does help you to look good or to fit in, which is important to this group. They're not yet convinced of those more functional benefits. So they're not vaping. This group is not vaping for anything other than looking good, having fun. They're not yet saying that it's about coping, stress, or mental health strategies. They also do care about the opinions of their parents. Parents are at the top of their list of whose opinion do you care about when it comes to vaping. But they also trust the views of health professionals and health organisations, their doctor, school health nurse, etc. And they do listen to social media. Again, we would hypothesise from the qualitative research that the reason this group is vaping at low levels of frequency is partly because they know about consequences amongst the people who matter to them. A consequence either being a punishment, a consequence at school being suspension, but also just disappointing the people that matter to them is still, I think, a moderating influence on how often these teens are vaping, as well as opportunity. Because as I said before, this is a segment that have not yet bought their own vape. So how are they vaping? Infrequently, as I said, about every few months, but certainly there are teens in here that are vaping weekly or every few days. They believe vaping is really common in their age group, as I said before, because they are experiencing vaping as a clustered social behaviour. And they only vape with people who are in their close social circles or at parties. As I said, they are less likely to have bought their own vape. Very few owned their own vape compared to the attached and the committed segments. And I think this is another element that's really influential and predictive of whether a teenager is going on to become a regular vapor. Owning your own vape is what committed, addicted vapors have described as being the start of the slippery slope to addiction. And the data supports that those in the experimenter segment, very few of them have bought their own vape. They are the most likely of all vapors to only be sharing vapes, the vape of others. So how can we influence experimenters? They definitely need access to good fact-based information about contents, harms, and to make the immediate harms present for them. So they will challenge the view of that vaping is harmful with the rebuttal that I am only doing this every month. So how do we bring the immediate harms? How do we make them real and salient, that every puff is doing them damage in one way or another? And that it's very difficult to avoid the slippery slope to addiction once you have a vape in your pocket. So we want to focus the messaging for this segment around personal susceptibility and make the cognitive dissonance for them strong and compelling, challenging their belief that harm is linked to dose, and explain how nicotine addiction works for them. They really have no clue about what nicotine withdrawal feels like and what it's signaling to their body in terms of the harm that it's flagging. So joining the dots between nicotine, vaping, and also mental health harms is relevant information for this segment. This is new information for this segment, particularly around mental health harms and how mental health harms can be experienced as part of nicotine addiction. And just reinforcing that staying at low risk of addiction means not owning your own vape. So we're not saying that it's okay to vape, just don't have your own. But if anything, the messaging to this segment is please do not buy your own vape. So what do they need? They need, first of all, to know how to spot the early signs of addiction and really to challenge the view with this group that if you're vaping and it's for reasons other than fun, then you need to really be, this is a red flag and a watch out that you may well be moving into withdrawal and addiction. Encourage them to self-reflect on their own vaping behaviour. For many of these teenagers, this is something that they're just doing and not thinking a lot about. And when in the research we were able to actually ask them to reflect on how conscious and how happy were they about their vaping behaviour, we did see signs of contrition and remorse and admission that this is probably something that I haven't thought a lot about and is probably not a good decision for me. Really encouraging them to talk to their parents about vaping, but also we need to make sure that their parents are also well informed about vaping and are sharing their view and making their view known to their teenagers that vaping is a really bad decision. And also strengthening their skills. If we're going to ask them to stop, which will be the call to action for this group, arming them with the capability and the skills to navigate those social settings and those conversations in order to say no and mean no. So the only thing we think is not helpful for this team, this group, is to challenge them on the fun benefits of vaping. So saying that actually, challenging them that it isn't fun is not going to work with this group, because for them, vaping is fun. It is a social lubricant. It is a way into social groups. It does give them social credibility. It does help them to fit in and belong. So we need to, rather than challenge that head on, actually arm them and inform them with the other ways and support them with the other ways that I've described. So moving on now to the sixth segment, our segment that we've called or referred to as the attached. So these teenagers are now vaping more frequently, and it's longer than it's no longer just a shared social thing to do. So now we see the influence of motivation and need and opportunity becoming part of the predictive attribute set of this segment. So they're vaping at least monthly, but many are vaping weekly or daily. And importantly, now we see many own their own vape. They can describe a whole range of benefits to vaping that go beyond being fun, a fun thing to do. So for this segment now, it's not just about fitting in, and it's not just about the tricks. It's actually delivering to them a whole range of mood control benefits that they believe are worthwhile. But they also think that they are not addicted and that they can avoid addiction. So the differentiating factor between this segment and the final segment, the segment we call the committed or the addicted, is that this segment believe that they are not addicted to vaping, that they are nowhere near addiction. Following the demographic patterns, this group indexes far more female and older. So we see now a skew towards the upper high school years. Not surprisingly, they have an appetite for taking risks. They do like to challenge authority. They have the strongest desire of all the segments, including the committed segments, to wanting to fit in. They are also the most social of the segments. So they are at parties and in social settings where they like making new friends, and vaping forms part of that enabler of a way to go out, perhaps with your friendship group or one person from your friendship group, and come away with new friends that you have made through vaping. They're in paid work. They're also very active on social media. So what places them in the attached segment? As I said before, this is a group, and this is why they're a concern to us, is that they're very comfortable with how much they're vaping, how often they're vaping and how much, and they truly believe that they have it under control. They do not believe that they're addicted. They overestimate how widespread vaping is, as I said, because so much of their vaping is being done in social settings and in clustered vaping settings. They've got a skewed view of how many people in their age group are vaping. They're not hanging out with the rejectors, the uninteresteds, or the susceptibles. So as a group, collectively, they see many benefits to vaping, but they don't all vape for the same reasons. This is really important for this segment, is that it's actually not as homogenous as we'd like them to be, perhaps. Although what they have many things in common in terms of how often they're vaping, the fact that they're now using their own vape, but they're vaping for different motivations. So some of them, it's predominantly social and social benefits, but for others, it's predominantly mental health and mood control benefits. Most are vaping, as I said, weekly to monthly, but concerningly, 22% of this group are vaping daily or almost daily. 39% actually own their own vape on the day that we conducted this survey. So a high proportion of this segment are vaping using their own vape, although they're also sharing vapes frequently. They're vaping now beyond in private settings or with just their close friends. So this is now a behaviour for them that's very social. As I said, it's a way to be doing something and meeting new people and sharing vapes through that process. And their vaping opportunities and settings have widened now beyond parties, beyond private homes and parties, but into, almost everywhere. So they're in outdoor spaces, parks, public transport hubs, shopping centres, etc. So how can we help or influence the attached? Yes, we need to educate them and inform them about the contents of vapes so that they're very clear about the chemicals and the harms that they're ingesting and inhaling. We really want to challenge them in a respectful, empathic way that their vaping behaviour is harmful because they think it's harmless and it's not under their control, particularly if they own their own vape. And we know this because when we deep dived with the addicted or the committed segment, one of the common stories amongst that segment was when we asked them to reflect back as to where they think their addiction started, it was when they made the decision to buy their own vape and be a sharer of a vape rather than a sharee, if you like. It's addicted teenagers who themselves said that started my slippery slope towards addiction. So we really want to encourage through our messaging, our tailored messaging and tailored interventions to empower this segment to reflect on their own vaping behaviour rather than to judge them, to just encourage them to think about it critically. Are they happy with how often they're vaping? Is this something that they want to keep doing? And to just remind them gently that they really can't be fully in control of something when they don't know what's in it. They don't know how much nicotine they're taking in. They don't know what chemicals they're taking in. We also think that there's a lot of opportunity, particularly for this segment, as well as the other vaping segments, to talk about cigarette equivalency when it comes to nicotine in vapes. All of the segments, but even the non-vaping segments, had a highly negative opinion of cigarette smoking. They saw that as something that they did not want to be doing. They know that it's bad for them and they don't challenge, they don't believe there's any benefits, generally speaking, in smoking cigarettes. And yet they don't transfer those opinions and beliefs to e-cigarettes or vapes. So how can we start to talk in terms of nicotine equivalency when it comes to vaping and smoking? Can we at some point be able to talk about every puff you take from a vape, how that equates to in terms of nicotine to cigarettes, because they all have an appetite for this. We had many, many teenagers asking us in the research, well, how many cigarettes is in my vape? Noting that vapes come in different sizes and with different numbers of puffs as well as different nicotine amounts. We want to also help them to spot the signs of addiction and also to recognise and challenge themselves about when might they be vaping, when might their motivation be actually moving more towards mental health benefits or coping strategies or dealing with stress rather than it being about fun, about the tricks and about fitting in. And of course, we want to discourage them from owning their own vape and from buying vapes. So what do the attached need? Support and encouragement, certainly, and skills to build their confidence and capability to cut back or to stop. We want them to have ready access to quit support and tailored support that responds and recognises where teenagers are at in terms of the challenge of stopping vaping. I think it's highly likely that whilst there are teenagers in this segment who responded to the question, do you feel that you're addicted, with a no, that actually they may well be experiencing withdrawal symptoms, some of them. And so we do want them to have ready access to quit support and also services and a response that acknowledges that some of these teens will be experiencing withdrawal while they're at school. So how do we respond to those teenagers with empathy and acknowledgement that they're experiencing withdrawal whilst we mandate that they attend school? Perhaps amnesty support from parents and others, really encouraging parents to and arming parents with the right and helpful information how to have conversations with their teenagers who are vaping if they get a disclosure from their teen that says, I want to stop now. So finally, this leads me to the final segment, the segment that we have coined the committed segment, but who are defined primarily by the fact that they have themselves self-identified as being addicted to vaping. So teens in this segment are vaping for a whole raft of reasons around emotional control, for coping reasons, and also in response to withdrawal, nicotine withdrawal. For many of them, concerningly, they believe that vaping is the safest option for them in terms of coping with whatever's going on for them, that vaping is the most harmless choice they can make when it comes to coping options. Many want to cut down or quit, but they lack the self-belief or the confidence that they can do that. Many had tried to stop before, and concerningly, many in this segment were almost resigned to the fact that they've tried and they failed, and so they've just given up now, and they just have assumed that they'll be vaping for a long time. This group skews demographically the oldest. It's skewing female, following the pattern. And so most of them are in upper high school. They are risk takers and do have tendencies towards challenging authority or rebellion. So they have personality influencing them, as well as all of these other conditions. They are the heaviest users of social media for friend making. So a lot of their friendship hookups begin on social media, but they also rely heavily on parties, and their paid work is also a social opportunity, a friend-making opportunity for them. Far less engaged in the more structured forms of friend-making around clubs, community-based organisations, is not really part of their social world anymore. And they have got more disposable income from their own paid work than the other segments. So what is making them a committed? First of all, they truly believe that vaping is hard to stop once you start, and they consider themselves to be addicted. They believe that they know a lot about nicotine addiction. They know about the chemicals. We don't have to convince this group that vaping is bad for them. Cost, sadly, is not a main barrier to their access to disposable vapes, but they do regret vaping because they believe it's costing them a lot of money. And as I said before, this group believes that actually they're making a safe or a safer choice when it comes to all the risky things they could be doing. They think that vaping is probably the best decision they could make. Many of them would like to stop, and they openly acknowledge that they would need help to give up. This is not something that they think that they can do on their own, and they acknowledge that they would need quit support. They believe that most people in their age group vape, so they believe that it's normalised, and this is because they, again, are socialising in groups with a higher prevalence of vaping. So they're vaping at least once a week, but mostly daily, and in all settings, in all social situations, on their own and with friends and with family. So it's not a behaviour now that they're trying to hide. 90% of this segment are using their own vape, as well as sharing with others, sharing their vape with others and sharing others' vapes. The majority are using dispos or disposables, but a third are now starting to use refillables as well as disposables. So how can we influence this group? Well, as well as persuading and motivating and building their confidence that it is possible to quit, we do want to prompt their self-reflection about their readiness to give quitting a go, reminding them about the short-term and long-term harms, of course, that because they will recognise these. They will particularly recognise short-term harms because they will be experiencing some of these themselves. So we really want to frame quitting in terms of gains rather than losses. We want to find ways to tip the cost-benefit equation in terms of what they gain by quitting. Really explaining how nicotine withdrawal is tricking them into feeling relaxed or calmer, and to provide and arm them with ways to substitute vaping with other positive mental health coping tricks and tips, to be able to frame the behaviour change as a swap rather than just a stop, is something that many in this segment were interested in. And I guess also, and as all good quit services will be doing very well, reminding them that not everybody succeeds on their first quit attempt, to address that mindset of resignation or almost having given up on being anything other than a vapor in the future. What is probably not helpful is talking about the mental health harms. When we put this forward in the research as a potential hook for messaging, we got a lot of pushback from this group who would say things like, well, how can it be more harmful because my life was pretty crap and that's why I started vaping in the first place. So talking about positive mental health coping strategies is certainly where there is fertile ground, rather than talking about mental health harms, because they already were experiencing, many of them, poor mental health before they started vaping. So to wrap up, what did the commission need? Well, obviously they need our empathy, our attention and our support that's tailored to them as teenagers, and particularly a group of teenagers who are going through nicotine addiction at school for, most of their day. How are they going to manage nicotine withdrawal in classroom settings and on school grounds where there are severe consequences being caught vaping? They also need guidance in order to have conversations with their parents to reach out for help, as well as to access the really good quit support that's available through Quit Lines, Headspace and other organisations. And to introduce them to this notion of behavioural swaps when it comes to, we need to be mindful of, for the committed teens as well as the attached teens, we're asking them to give up something that they really like doing and that has a lot of benefits for them. So acknowledging that we're asking them to stop something that they want to keep doing, what are we going to offer them as an alternative, needs to be part of the thinking behind our message framing. So to wrap up, I'm mindful that I have just burdened you with a whole lot of information about each of these segments. It's a lot to take in, we know, and it's a lot to hold in your head. But one of the reasons that the BCC embarked upon this research was to be able to share with the wide public health community and enable all of you working in this space, I guess, to have some insights into understanding where teenagers are at and what are the different mindsets, motivations and influences for teenagers that sit inside the vaping prevalence data. To understand that we need to take different messaging and different intervention designs to these different segments. Teenagers sitting in these different segments need different things from us as health professionals, as educators, as social marketers. Depending on where they sit in the segments, they need different information with different emphasis and different support, different conversations. So coming out of the project, just to tell you where you can get more information, we've produced together with VicHealth both a summary report and there's also the detailed technical report. So the summary report is both on the BCC's website as a downloadable report, as well as VicHealth's website. The technical report is available on our website. And also we produced together with VicHealth a parent conversation guide, which is a really great report that is product which is either downloadable or it's available as an interactive tool on the VicHealth website or downloadable from us at the BCC. This is designed for parents to guide the conversation in a non-judgmental, non-threatening way to be able to determine what kind of teenager do you have in your family. Indeed, you may well have teenagers who sit in more than one segment in your family. And finally, if you're interested in the original piece of qualitative deep dive research, Being Gen Vape, that led to the segmentation, that report in its entirety is also available on the BCC's website. So I think at this point, I'm probably going to be told I've gone horribly over time and I need to open up for questions.
Great. No, Donna, you did very well for time. We now have some time for a Q&A, so please type your questions in the Slido and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can during this time. There's been a lot of questions about if this webinar is being recorded. The answer is yes, it is being recorded and it will be sent out to you all as soon as possible. We've also seen a couple questions about access to the parent conversation guide that Donna mentioned. Luke has answered the question in the Slido chat and has provided the link, but this will also be available in a follow-up email that will be sent to you all. Luke and Donna, I'll let you decide who is best to answer each of the questions from the audience. But our first question is from Tegan. If this never have, never will group is skewed towards younger, could we expect that their status may change as they become older?
That's a really good question. And I think we can't rule that out. I mean, if I had my way, I would repeat this segment, I would track this segmentation over time so we could see where the segments are shifting and what the propensity is to move. But given that this is a first time that this has ever been done, I think the group least likely to ever go on to vape is the rejector vape, is the rejector segment. And I've got more confidence that that segment will remain rejecting than any other segment. And that's partly because it's defined by personality as well as by opportunity and knowledge and information. So I think there's just, you know, a fifth of teenagers in any society that are going to make good decisions regardless, and that's probably that group. I'm less confident about the uninterested and the susceptibles.
Yep, awesome. The next question is from Laura. So based on your research, do we know where the young people access the vape if they weren't purchased?
We do, and that data is in the full report, but it's from, sorry, I'm just adjusting I'm getting a note to adjust my camera, so forgive me if I'm not right in the middle. So they're getting it from a whole range of settings, so both through peer groups as well as through retailers and older siblings. Some even said that they got it from grandparents or they've nicked their own parents. But in terms of purchasing vapes, it's social media sales and face-to-face through older teenagers, so the upper years who are trading them to the younger ones in particular.
Great. How many students were interviewed in the research, and were all the interviews done in one school or over a few?
Sure. So for the segmentation study, there was just under 3,700 interviews, all done through an online survey. But the way into the survey was recruited through what we call multi-modes, so that teenagers were able to do the survey by online panels, which is a pretty typical way to do online surveying, but also through schools. And I'll just mention there that there was a two-level consent process for the interviews. So parent consent had to be given for a teenager to take part in the survey. So once the parent consent was given, the teenager was then independently sent the link to the survey, not from their parent. And then also through schools as well, with the teacher giving consent. And then once the teenager entered the survey, they then also undertook an informed consent process about a question so that they knew what the survey was about.
Did you ask about dual use with tobacco smoking?
No, we didn't. So the average interview length was, I think, 32 minutes. And that was that we made a decision about that very early on. There's a lot of very strong academic research happening around this very topic about dual use. And we didn't feel that that's where the BCC could really add value. And what we did was we preferred to spend the interview time on really understanding this complex mix of motivations and opportunity, instead.
Some question from Lorena. How were young people recruited during the study?
So that one I've already might have answered. So recruited both through online panels around Australia as well as through schools who agreed to take part.
Awesome. sorting through the questions. What, in your opinion, has been some insights that maybe surprised or concerned you during this process?
Luke, I'm wondering whether you might want to, do you want me to answer that one, or do you want to have a go?
Well, I think we can both have, I think there's a number of things that have fallen out. I think for me, probably the most surprising and perhaps concerning was this overriding sense of control that a lot of the teens felt, and particularly in terms of their ability to navigate addiction and the slide that way. So a lot of the teens that we speak to who are now, vaping regularly are of the view that they'll be able to stop quite quickly. And so, yeah, this idea of control and actually really needing to challenge that, I think, is something that really fell out for me anyway. Donna, you might have others.
And I guess the two things for me was, first of all, that perhaps we underestimate the influence of parents, particularly amongst teenagers who are choosing not to vape, that they really are a strong influence. And what we found when we asked the question, whose opinion matters to you the most when it comes to vaping, the overwhelming majority of teenagers put parents at the top of that list, irrespective of their age, irrespective of whether or not they vape or how much they vape. So that was one, not a surprise, but I guess it was a real cue to where we can work in terms of intervention. And then the other perhaps surprise to me was, really what it revealed in terms of what do we do is that we need to go younger than high school. That susceptible group is susceptible because of their curiosity. And I think if we as a community of public health and social marketers can actually turn our attention to the year 5, 6s and address curiosity in a way that builds capability and skills to reject vaping. So if we can convert susceptibles to rejectors at year 5 and 6, I think it's a great way to move forward.
Great. Question from Lauren. Is this research being made available in different languages?
Luke,
look, at this stage, to be quite honest with you, it isn't. However, I'm sure that's a conversation we can have because obviously we would like to get it out to as many as possible. So I think we'll sort of take that one on advice and work on that. Yeah.
Yep, great. Question from Tara. Do you think parental consent reduced the vaping cohort who responded?
Great question. As researchers, it's one that we agonise over all the time. Yes, undoubtedly, we would have teenagers who were invited to the survey who chose not to. I think the size of our sample has helped to smooth that out. And we were very careful in the way that the invitation to parents was done off the large panels. And we worked off 3 different panels all over Australia, not just one panel. But anyway, it was important that once the parent gave consent, then the teenager was sent the link by the panel company, not by the parent. So we really tried to overcome and not put kids in situations where they're answering yes or no to vaping with their parent leaning over their shoulder or in the other room. So, and we also, importantly, we inserted 2 questions at the end of the survey, which asked teenagers, this is the first time I've ever done this in teen research, how honest they felt they could be about their vaping and about the survey. And so basically we asked them to what extent they'd lied. I actually think we saw higher honesty scores in the online panel sample than we did in the school survey samples. So to some extent, I think we get more lying or opting out of the survey at the prevalence question in the school sample, because we know perhaps that is a more illicit behaviour in school settings than it is in home settings, would be a hypothesis.
Awesome. And for us to wrap up with the last question from Caitlin, are there key messages / information that will be universally appropriate for all segments, or is there info that we should avoid when talking to broad audience of young people?
Oh, look, you're not going to do any harm talking about harms of, positioning vaping as an undesirable behaviour that's bad for you, that has short and long-term health consequences, is a universal message that will do no harm across any of the segments. I do think we need to be careful and nuanced and targeted when we talk about mental health consequences, because I think that could make a whole lot of committed teenagers feel worse. and it's probably not relevant to the rejectors, for example. But in the summary report, we do actually talk in quite a lot of detail about what message frames are going to be useful and where to perhaps be cautious segment by segment.
Thank you. Sorry if we didn't get to your question, but that brings us to the end of the webinar today. I'd like to give a special thank you to Luke and Donna from the Behaviour Change Collaborative for their time today. Thank you for taking us through this important research and answering any of the questions from our online audience. To everyone that has joined us here today online, VicHealth will follow up with communication about the research, the recording for today's webinar to watch, and where to find more information. Thank you again, and have a nice rest of your day.